Alright, this is going to be the second season review of Buffy, non-spoiler, so if you're completely new to Buffy, hopefully this will not in any way deter your enjoyment of the series from this season or the later series. Okay, so let's begin with the good parts. On the one hand, from the perspective of season 1, this is a huge jump in quality. There are much better performances, better stunts, better special effects. There's more confidence in the storytelling, the plots have improved, and so on and so forth. So, as a whole, the season is a lot stronger, and also a lot longer than season 1, which really felt chaotic and meandering, and didn't seem to have much of a focus, and it's only a handful of episodes are really worth returning to. So we're really seeing now the actual beginning of Buffy and its mythology, and where it's going to be spelled out, I think, more explicitly with the introduction of some new characters, some of whom will be here for a while, and some of whom will have only a very short stay within the narrative. So from the perspective of season 1, it's a huge jump in quality, and I don't want to diminish that. But I honestly feel like this is really only half a season of good episodes, and quite literally the other half are wasted opportunities or very poor filler episodes that don't really add much to the larger narrative and just seem to just be spending their time on very small minutia and not going anywhere. You can enjoy some of these, I suppose, but it's going to be very subjective in my opinion in terms of like why it has any power at all. Probably one interesting kind of pivot episode is the Halloween episode, where it's sort of a mid-ranged episode where it's pretty good. I actually enjoy it a lot, but it kind of shows the problem with the season as a whole, where you see a lot of promise in terms of what the story will be later, but you're really just getting a prototype. You're not really getting the actual thing, especially towards the end. At least to me, felt a series of contrived twists and turns of how things are going to happen with Buffy and the core group, which is now made up of Angel, Cordelia, Willow, and technically Oz. Although Oz is not a major character in this season, he will become much more important later. That's not a spoiler because you're going to get a lot of clues early on in terms of what his role is, which is sort of being an interesting romantic foil to Xander. So on the whole, I think it is a pretty good season, but again, in terms of being analytic, the lower episodes really drag it down a lot. They're worth skipping and they're not really worth engaging in. But the ending for me was really what really sank the season. It just really didn't make sense in terms of the plot. It didn't make sense in terms of the character or why people were acting the way they do. The legend and mythology just are created out of nowhere. Just new characters just come in, period. They're not really introduced or built up. It's just they're there. We're supposed to take this for granted, and I just didn't understand it at all. And even when you work through the premise, it just sounds so ridiculous and silly. So it really does puzzle me that people consider this one of the best seasons of Buffy, or even the best season, because the ending, for me anyway, worked out very lukewarm. It just didn't make a whole lot of sense. I'm not saying it does have to make sense. I mean, Buffy, by definition, is an extremely weird series with a lot of things do not make a lot of sense, and you have to accept some of the absurdities of the mythologies, but I think with the conclusion, they just went a little too far. I can understand they wanted to have major character changes to really give the audience a twist. I just felt the twist in terms of what happens to one or two of the central characters really didn't make a lot of sense, and it just felt very improvised. Now, I'm sure they planned it all out, but it just felt that given what we know or will understand about vampires and how selfish they are, why this or that person changes allegiances or moves in a certain direction or helps another person out really didn't make a lot of sense. So that part felt very iffy to me. However, I will say there is a kind of tragedy in the second season because we're sort of saying farewell to the horror background of Buffy. This is sort of like the last season that takes the horror aspect of Buffy pretty seriously. We're still going to see a lot of horror monsters and a lot of horror tropes. This is really the last season that really tries to combine both horror and comedy in a kind of uneasy alliance. And they're basically going to start moving away from that and moving more towards a fairy tale, fantasy, even sci-fi direction, which I didn't mind. It's just an interesting thing that people get Buffy confused all the time. In the beginning is very indebted to horror movies. And the later seasons really forget that, and it really just horror movies and the horror background no longer matter. And I will admit there were a couple of moments, I won't say which ones because that'll be a spoiler, which were genuinely frightening. So I do think in some ways it did work in terms of how the stories were structured. But I just thought overall, the final parts, as well as some of the middle chapters, didn't make sense. There's just too many holes. But again, if you're not being very analytic, you can just sort of enjoy the kind of grandiose, spectacular ending, which, given the limits of a budget that they had at the time, were pretty impressive. And they did put a lot of work in, but I just thought emotionally and logically just never really connected, I think. But that's just looking at it from a more critical eye. If you are just looking for the spectacle and the emotions of the character, I think you'll be mostly satisfied with Season 2. Alright, this has been a non-spoiler review of Season 2 of Buffy. If you like the content, please hit the like button and or subscribe. Thank you for listening. Please be safe.